Coward, you're a disgrace to this family." Those words echoed off the marble walls of the federal courthouse in Arlington, Virginia, as I stood in my cheap navy blazer, watching my younger brother Marcus stride past me like I was invisible. The reporters with their cameras and microphones turned away from me the moment he appeared, like moths abandoning a dim bulb for the sun. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm Sarah Mitchell, I'm 32, and while my family was about to watch Marcus receive a Medal of Honor recommendation in court, I had just spent 18 months in places that don't exist on any map, doing things that would never make it into any newspaper. They just didn't know it yet. The courthouse steps were packed with military families, veterans advocates, and local politicians positioning themselves for photo opportunities. Everyone was here for the same reason: to witness Captain Marcus Mitchell receive recognition for his heroic actions during a convoy ambush in Afghanistan that had supposedly saved 12 soldiers. I pushed through the crowd, my government-issued credentials tucked safely in my jacket pocket, the same credentials that had gotten me through 3 layers of security that morning, though I'd told no one about them. "Sarah!" My mother's voice cut through the noise, sharp with disapproval. "What are you doing here? This is Marcus's day." Patricia Mitchell stood at the base of the courthouse steps in her best dress, the one she reserved for church and important occasions. Next to her, my father adjusted his American Legion pin with the practiced precision of a man who had never let anyone forget his Army service from 30 years ago. "I came to support Marcus," I said simply. My mother's expression soured. "Support? By showing up in that ratty old suit? Sarah, this is a federal ceremony. There will be generals here, congresspeople. Couldn't you at least have made an effort?" Behind her, I could see Marcus being interviewed by a local news crew. Even from 50 feet away, he commanded attention. 6'2", dress blues pressed to perfection, ribbons aligned with mathematical precision. The golden son who had followed Dad's footsteps into the military and actually made something of himself, unlike his older sister who had washed out after barely a year in the service. "Ma'am?" A court security officer appeared at my elbow. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" My parents looked surprised that anyone official would know my name. I nodded. "Judge Harrison needs to see you in chambers before the ceremony begins. If you'll follow me?" I felt 3 sets of eyes boring into my back as I followed the officer into the courthouse. My mother called after me, "Sarah, what's this about? What did you do now?" What did I do now? The question that had followed me through every family gathering for the past 5 years, ever since I'd left the Army under circumstances I couldn't explain, and started working what they assumed was some meaningless government desk job in Washington. The security officer led me through corridors that smelled like marble cleaner and old wood, past courtrooms where justice played out in measured, public proceedings. Nothing like the world I actually inhabited, where justice happened in shadows and silence, where the most important victories were the ones nobody ever heard about. Judge Harrison's chambers were austere but dignified: law books, an American flag, photographs with politicians and military leaders spanning 3 decades. The judge himself was exactly what central casting would order for a federal ceremony. Silver-haired, stern-faced, the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture instinctively. "Miss Mitchell," he said, not looking up from a thick manila folder on his desk. "Please, sit down." I remained standing. "Your Honor, if this is about the ceremony, I should mention that I'm not listed as a speaker or participant. I'm just here as a family." Judge Harrison looked up then, his gray eyes studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a complex legal brief. "Miss Mitchell, how much do you know about your brother's Medal of Honor recommendation?" The question caught me off guard. I know he saved 12 soldiers during an ambush in Kunar province. He's being recognized for extraordinary valor under fire. That's the public version, yes. The judge opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a classified briefing document, the kind with red borders and security classifications I recognized all too well. "Are you familiar with Operation Silent Thunder?" My blood went cold. I hadn't heard that operation name spoken aloud in over a year, and certainly not in civilian company. I kept my expression neutral, the way I'd been trained. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I don't know what you're referring to. Judge Harrison smiled grimly. Miss Mitchell, I have a top-secret clearance. I've been briefed on classified military operations for the past 8 years, as part of my role in military tribunal cases. Operation Silent Thunder was a joint CIA military intelligence operation targeting high-value assets in the Afghan-Pakistan border region. He slid a photograph across the desk, black and white, grainy, taken from what looked like drone surveillance. It showed a convoy of military vehicles stopped along a mountain road, soldiers taking defensive positions behind the trucks. This photograph was taken 47 minutes before the ambush that made your brother famous. What's interesting is the timestamp. He pointed to the bottom corner of the image. According to this, someone called in a warning about the ambush location 23 minutes before Captain Mitchell's convoy altered their route. I stared at the photograph, my heart pounding in a rhythm I hoped didn't show on my face. The someone who called in that warning, Judge Harrison continued, was a military intelligence operative embedded with local assets, providing real-time tactical support to forward units. Someone who had been tracking insurgent communications for weeks and recognized the setup forming along the original route. He pulled out another document, this one with my service record header clearly visible at the top. Sergeant First Class Sarah Mitchell, Military Intelligence Corps, deployed to Forward Operating Base Chapman from March 2019 to September 2020. Specialized in signals intelligence and tactical communications intercept. My throat felt dry. Your Honor, I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because, Judge Harrison said, closing the folder with deliberate precision, the hero story that's about to be celebrated in that courtroom is missing some crucial details. Your brother received a Bronze Star for valor during that ambush. He led his men effectively, maintained unit cohesion under fire, and minimized casualties through tactical leadership. He leaned back in his chair, but the reason there were only 3 wounded instead of 12 dead was because someone changed their route based on intelligence that prevented them from driving directly into a kill zone. Someone whose work will never be publicly acknowledged because it remains classified at levels that most people in that courtroom don't even know exist. I could hear the distant sound of voices and movement from the main courthouse. Families gathering, officials taking their places, reporters setting up their equipment for the ceremony that would make Marcus the family hero once and for all. Your Honor, with respect, I don't understand why you're sharing classified information with me. Judge Harrison stood and walked to his window, which offered a view of the courthouse steps where my family waited. Because in 10 minutes, I'm going to present a Medal of Honor recommendation to a man whose bravery was unquestionable, but whose survival and the survival of his men depended on intelligence provided by someone who can never receive public recognition for her service. He turned back to me. Because your parents are sitting out there, proud of their son the war hero, completely unaware that their daughter prevented what would have been the deadliest convoy attack in that region in over 2 years. My hands were shaking now, just slightly, but enough that I clasped them behind my back. Your Honor, even if what you're saying were true, there are protocols. Classification levels exist for good reasons. Some things have to stay secret. Yes, he agreed. But some secrets create injustices that are just as damaging as the revelations they're meant to prevent. Through the window, I could see Marcus being positioned for photographs with local politicians. He looked confident, comfortable, born for this kind of attention. Everything I had never been allowed to be. Judge Harrison returned to his desk and picked up what looked like an official government document with multiple signatures and seals. Miss Mitchell, 3 hours ago, Operation Silent Thunder was partially declassified by executive order. The intelligence reports that saved your brother's convoy have been cleared for limited release in conjunction with this ceremony. I felt the world shift slightly on its axis. Which means, he continued, that for the first time in 5 years, you're going to be publicly recognized for service to your country that went far beyond what anyone in your family ever imagined. The sound of voices from the courtroom was getting louder, more organized. The ceremony was about to begin. I don't understand, I said quietly. Marcus is receiving the Medal of Honor. This is his day, his recognition. Judge Harrison nodded. And he deserves it. What he did under fire was extraordinary. But what you did in the weeks leading up to that ambush, the intelligence gathering, the pattern recognition, the split-second decision to override standard protocol and warn a convoy about to enter a kill zone, that was extraordinary too. He handed me the document he'd been holding. This is a presidential unit citation with valor, along with a promotion to major in the Military Intelligence Corps, retroactive to your date of separation from active duty. Your work on... A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Operation Silent Thunder has been credited with saving the lives of 47 American service members over an 18-month period. I stared at the document, reading my name in official type, seeing words like extraordinary heroism and distinguished service, and exceptional contribution to mission success. Major Mitchell, Judge Harrison said, and I looked up to see him standing at attention. It's time for your family to understand what you've really been doing for the past 5 years. The courtroom was packed when we walked in, every seat filled with families, veterans, local dignitaries, and reporters. At the front, Marcus stood with perfect military bearing next to a display that included enlarged photographs from his deployment, commendation letters from his commanding officers, and a detailed account of the convoy ambush that had made him a local hero. My parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride. My mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed by the honor being bestowed on her son. My father sat ramrod straight, every inch the proud Army veteran whose boy had followed in his footsteps and exceeded every expectation. They didn't see me enter through the side door with Judge Harrison. Their attention was completely focused on Marcus, just like it had been for the past 15 years. But in 60 seconds, when Judge Harrison called my name and announced the declassification of Operation Silent Thunder, they would learn that the daughter they'd dismissed as a failure had been protecting soldiers like Marcus from threats they never saw coming. And this time, unlike every other moment of my life, they wouldn't be able to look away. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Harrison's voice carried across the packed courtroom with the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. Before we proceed with today's primary ceremony, I need to address a matter of national security that has just been declassified by executive order. The murmur of conversation died instantly. Camera operators swiveled their equipment toward the judge's bench, sensing something unexpected was about to unfold. I watched from the side entrance as my family's expressions shifted from anticipation to confusion. Marcus, standing at attention beside his display of heroism, glanced toward the judge with the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen from him all day. His commanding officer, Colonel Davies, frowned and reached for his phone, probably wondering if there had been some protocol breach. 3 hours ago, Judge Harrison continued, holding up an official document with presidential seals. Portions of a classified military intelligence operation were cleared for public release. Operation Silent Thunder, conducted in the Afghan-Pakistan border region from 2019 to 2020, has been credited with preventing multiple attacks on American forces and saving the lives of 47 service members. I could see my mother whispering urgently to my father, probably asking if he knew what this had to do with Marcus's ceremony. Dad's face was stone, the way it always got when military matters took unexpected turns. The intelligence operative responsible for Operation Silent Thunder's success, Judge Harrison said, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom, has served with distinction in classified roles for the past 5 years, unable to receive public recognition due to the sensitive nature of her work. Her work, the pronoun hung in the air like smoke. Judge Harrison gestured toward me. Major Sarah Mitchell, would you please join us? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning cycling on. Every head in the courtroom turned toward me, 300 pairs of eyes trying to process what they'd just heard. Major Sarah Mitchell. I walked down the center aisle on legs that felt disconnected from my body, hyper-aware of every footstep echoing off the marble floor. My mother's mouth was open in shock. My father sat frozen, his American Legion pin catching the light as his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Marcus watched me approach, with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dismissal, not irritation, but something approaching recognition, as if he was seeing me for the first time in 15 years. The reporters were having a field day. cameras clicking, phones appearing to capture video of the moment when a military ceremony took a completely unexpected turn. Local news anchors were undoubtedly scrambling to figure out who I was and why a federal judge was calling me Major. "Major Mitchell," Judge Harrison said as I reached the front of the courtroom, "please remain at ease." Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to share with you has been cleared for release by the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. He opened a folder that I now realized contained not just my service record but operational summaries, intelligence reports, and commendation letters from people whose names would never appear in any public ceremony. In March 2019, then Sergeant First Class Sarah Mitchell was deployed to Forward Operating Base Chapman as part of a joint military intelligence task force. Her mission was to monitor insurgent communications, identify high-value targets, and provide real-time tactical support to American forces operating in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. My mother was staring at me like I was a stranger who had somehow replaced her daughter. Over the course of 18 months, Major Mitchell's intelligence work prevented 14 separate attacks on American convoys, led to the capture of 6 high-value insurgent leaders, and provided actionable intelligence that was credited with saving the lives of 47 American service members. Judge Harrison pulled out a photograph, the same drone surveillance image he'd shown me in chambers, but now projected on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. This photograph was taken on September 15, 2020, 47 minutes before the convoy ambush that would later make Captain Marcus Mitchell a decorated hero. He pointed to the timestamp. At 0847 hours, Major Mitchell intercepted insurgent communications, indicating that an improvised explosive device had been placed along Route Clearwater, the primary convoy path. Another photograph appeared, a detailed tactical map showing convoy routes, threat assessments, and communication intercepts marked in red. Against standard protocol, which would have required her to report the intelligence through normal channels, a process that would have taken 30 to 45 minutes, Major Mitchell made the decision to directly contact the convoy commander and recommend an immediate route change. I could see my father's hands gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. 30 years in the Army had taught him exactly what against standard protocol meant in terms of career consequences. That decision, Judge Harrison continued, resulted in Captain Mitchell's convoy avoiding a kill zone that would have resulted in an estimated 12 to 15 casualties. Instead, when insurgents were forced to pursue the convoy and engage in open combat rather than conducting an ambush, Captain Mitchell's leadership and tactical skill limited casualties to 3 wounded, none fatal. Marcus was staring at me now, his perfect military posture wavering slightly as the implications sank in. The ambush that had made him a hero, the moment that had defined him as the successful son, the one who had made something of himself, had only been survivable because of the intelligence I had provided. Major Mitchell's work on Operation Silent Thunder continued for 6 more months after her brother's convoy incident, Judge Harrison said. She was responsible for identifying and tracking the insurgent cell that had planned the attack, leading to their capture in December 2020. Her final mission report credited her with dismantling an entire network responsible for attacks on American forces throughout the Kunar province. He held up another document, this one, bearing signatures I recognized from the highest levels of military intelligence. Upon completion of Operation Silent Thunder, Major Mitchell was recruited by a joint CIA military intelligence task force for classified operations that I am not authorized to discuss. For the past 5 years, she has continued to serve her country in roles that require absolute secrecy and offer no possibility of public recognition. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the sound of camera shutters and the quiet sobbing of what sounded like my mother. "Major Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, addressing me directly for the first time since I joined him at the front of the courtroom. "By order of the President of the United States and with the authorization of the Department of Defense, you are hereby awarded the Presidential Unit Citation with Valor for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." He lifted a metal case from his desk, the same kind of presentation box that Marcus had been expecting to receive. "Your citation reads, for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services in armed conflict with insurgent forces in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan from March 2019 to March 2021. Major Mitchell's extraordinary heroism, exceptional professional skill, and complete dedication to duty resulted in the preservation of American lives and the successful completion of classified operations vital to national security. As he pinned the medal to the lapel of my cheap navy blazer, I could hear my mother's voice, broken and barely audible. Sarah, is this real?" Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Additionally, Major Mitchell is hereby promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, effective immediately, in recognition of her continued service to classified operations that remain vital to American national security." Lieutenant Colonel, the rank my father had never achieved in 30 years of service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison concluded, "it is my honor to present Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose service exemplifies the countless men and women who protect our nation from threats that most of us will never know existed." The applause started slowly, tentatively, as if people weren't sure whether they were allowed to clap during what had become the most surreal military ceremony in courthouse history. But it built, rolling through the packed courtroom like thunder, until even the reporters were applauding. I stood there in my ratty blazer with a presidential unit citation pinned to my chest, watching my family try to process the fact that their failure of a daughter had actually been protecting their golden son from dangers he'd never imagined. Marcus stepped forward, his dress blues immaculate, his own decorations suddenly seeming less important than they had an hour earlier. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried across the courtroom microphone system, I had no idea." I looked at him. My younger brother, the hero, the one who had always been everything I wasn't allowed to be, and realized that for the first time in our lives, we were finally standing on equal ground. "You weren't supposed to," I replied. "That was the point." But as the applause continued and my parents sat in the front row trying to reconcile 15 years of assumptions with the woman standing before them, I realized that everything was about to change. The secrets were out, the dismissal was over, and my family was about to learn what it meant to have a daughter they had never bothered to really know. Walking back into the courthouse felt like entering a completely different building. The same marble floors, the same packed gallery. But now the energy had shifted from polite ceremonial attention to something electric with genuine curiosity. People were leaning forward in their seats, whispering urgently to their neighbors, phones out as they tried to Google information about Operation Silent Thunder that wouldn't exist in any public database. Judge Harrison had clearly used the intermission to brief the assembled officials. Colonel Davies, who had looked confused and slightly irritated earlier, now wore the expression of an officer who had just received a significant intelligence update. The local politicians who had come for photo opportunities with Marcus were recalculating their positioning, probably wondering if they should be courting the mysterious intelligence officer instead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison announced as Marcus and I took our positions at the front of the courtroom, "we will now proceed with the presentation of Captain Marcus Mitchell's Bronze Star with Valor, followed by additional recognitions that have become possible due to recent declassification actions." The Bronze Star ceremony was everything Marcus had expected when he woke up that morning. Colonel Davies read his citation with appropriate military formality, describing his leadership during the convoy ambush in language that captured both the tactical complexity and the human cost of combat leadership. The medal itself was beautiful, bronze and blue ribbon, the kind of recognition that would hold a place of honor on any military resume. But as I watched Marcus receive his decoration, I could see something different in his posture. The ceremony he had been anticipating for months was unfolding exactly as planned, yet he kept glancing toward me, as if checking to make sure I was still there, still real, still the sister whose existence had just rewritten the story of his most defining moment. Captain Mitchell's actions under fire exemplify the finest traditions of military leadership, Colonel Davies concluded. His calm decision-making and tactical expertise prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of American lives. The applause was warm, genuine, the recognition of a community honoring one of their own. Marcus had earned every bit of it, and nothing about my role in providing intelligence changed the courage he had shown when the shooting started. Then Judge Harrison stepped forward again, holding a different folder. Before we conclude today's ceremony, I have additional presentations to make that were not possible until this morning's declassification. He opened the folder with deliberate ceremony. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, please step forward. The courtroom fell silent again, that same electric quiet that had greeted the earlier revelation. But this time, people were leaning forward with anticipation rather than confusion. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, in addition to the Presidential Unit citation presented earlier, you are hereby awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service in a position of significant responsibility. He lifted a metal case I hadn't seen before, this one containing a decoration I recognized but had never expected to receive. The Defense Superior Service Medal was typically reserved for senior officers in major command positions, not intelligence operatives working in the shadows. Your citation reads, for superior meritorious service while serving as Senior Intelligence Analyst for Joint Task Force Phantom from March 2021 to present, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's innovative analytical methods and exceptional operational security have been instrumental in preventing multiple terrorist attacks against American interests worldwide. Her work has directly contributed to the disruption of 17 planned attacks and the identification of 43 high-value targets. 17 attacks. The number hit the courtroom like a physical force. I could see people in the gallery doing mental math, trying to calculate how many lives that represented. How many families that had never needed to receive folded flags because of work they had never heard about. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell is hereby awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements. Another medal case, another citation read to a courtroom that was growing quieter with each revelation about the scope of my classified work. Finally, Judge Harrison said, and I could see him building toward something significant, by special order of the Secretary of Defense, and with the personal approval of the President of the United States, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell is hereby promoted to the rank of Colonel, effective immediately. Colonel. The rank that would make me senior to Marcus, senior to most of the officers in the courtroom, senior to anyone in my family's military history. Colonel Mitchell's promotion comes with assignment as Deputy Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations, a position that will allow her to transition from classified field operations to senior leadership roles within the intelligence community. Hey, I felt the weight of the eagles being pinned to my shoulders, the symbolic birds that represented not just rank but responsibility, authority, and recognition that had seemed impossible an hour earlier. But more than the promotions or medals, what struck me was the look on my family's faces. Dad sat with tears in his eyes, his own military service suddenly seeming like preparation for understanding what his daughter had accomplished. Mom held his hand, both of them staring at me as if seeing a stranger who had somehow replaced the daughter they thought they knew. And Marcus, standing beside me in his dress blues with his bronze star catching the courtroom lights, was smiling with what looked like genuine pride. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Harrison concluded, it is my privilege to present Colonel Sarah Mitchell and Captain Marcus Mitchell, siblings whose service exemplifies the best traditions of American military excellence, achieved through different paths but united in their commitment to protecting the lives of their fellow citizens. The applause this time was thunderous, sustained, the kind of recognition that felt like a dam breaking. People were standing, military personnel snapping to attention, civilians clapping with the enthusiasm reserved for moments when ordinary ceremonies become extraordinary revelations. I stood there in my transformed blazer, now heavy with medals I had never expected to receive publicly, looking out at a courtroom full of people who had begun the day expecting a routine military recognition and instead witnessed the declassification of 5 years of invisible service. But the most profound moment came when Marcus stepped closer and executed a perfect military salute, junior officer to senior officer, brother to sister, the first time in our lives that military protocol required him to show me the respect I had been earning in silence for years. Congratulations, Colonel, he said loud enough for the microphones to catch. It's an honor to serve in the same military as you. I returned his salute, feeling the weight of eagles on my shoulders and the eyes of my family finally seeing me for who I had actually been all along. The dismissal was over, the secrets were out, and for the first time in 5 years I was standing in a room where everyone could see exactly what I was worth. But as the ceremony concluded and people began to file out, I realized that the hardest part was still ahead, figuring out how to rebuild relationships with people who had spent years not knowing who I really was, and deciding whether the daughter they had dismissed was ready to forgive the family that had never bothered to look past their own assumptions. The restaurant Mom chose was vintage Patricia Mitchell, white tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where families celebrated graduations and anniversaries, where conversations were supposed to be civilized and emotions kept at reasonable volumes. She had made the reservation for 4 at Chez Laurent 3 hours after the courthouse ceremony, probably thinking we needed somewhere proper to process what had just happened to our family. What she hadn't anticipated was that proper restaurants weren't designed for conversations about classified military operations and 5 years of profound mutual misunderstanding. I still can't wrap my head around it, she said, carefully cutting her salmon into precise pieces she wasn't actually eating. 17 attacks, Sarah. 17 times you saved people's lives, and we never knew. Dad sat across from me, still wearing his suit from the ceremony but with his tie loosened, his American Legion pin positioned exactly where it always was. He kept studying my face like he was trying to memorize it, as if the daughter who had walked into that courthouse was somehow different from the one sitting across from him now. The hardest part, Marcus said, setting down his fork, is thinking about all the times I talked about my deployment like I was the only one in the family who understood what real service looked like. The silence that followed was loaded with 5 years of dinner-table conversations where Marcus's war stories had dominated, where his experiences had been treated as the gold standard for military service, where my vague government job had been dismissed as bureaucratic irrelevance. You couldn't have known, I said, the same response I'd been giving all afternoon, but even as I said it, I could hear the hollowness in my own voice. But we could have tried, Mom replied. We could have trusted you. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers touching the edge of my hand. When you left the army, when you wouldn't tell us why, when you took that job in Washington and wouldn't explain what you were doing, instead of assuming the worst, we could have assumed that you had good reasons. Could you have? The question came out sharper than I intended. Really? Because from where I sat, it felt like you were all too ready to believe I had failed. Dad's face tightened, the expression of a man being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. You're right, he said quietly. We were ready to believe that. And that says more about us than it does about you. The waiter appeared to refill our wine glasses, professionally invisible, but probably wondering why the family at table 12 looked like they were negotiating a peace treaty instead of celebrating whatever military ceremony had required everyone to dress up. I want to understand something, Marcus said, leaning forward with the focused attention he usually reserved for tactical briefings. The night before I deployed, you told me to be careful. You said Afghanistan was more dangerous than I realized. I thought you were just being an overprotective big sister. I remembered that conversation, standing in his apartment, looking at his deployment orders, knowing things about the region that I couldn't share but desperately wanting to prepare him for realities that weren't covered in standard pre-deployment briefings. I was being overprotective, I said, just not in the way you thought. You knew the specifics, didn't you, about the threats we'd be facing? I nodded slowly. I knew the insurgent networks, the typical attack patterns, the areas where intelligence suggested heightened activity. I couldn't tell you details, but I could tell you to be more careful than the briefings suggested. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, disrupting the military precision that had been perfect for the ceremony. Jesus, Sarah, you were trying to keep me alive with information you couldn't even share. That's what intelligence work is, I replied. Keeping people alive with information they can't know you have. Mom was crying again, but quietly this time, dabbing at her eyes with the cloth napkin. All those years, we thought you had given up on being the person we raised you to be. You raised me to serve, I said. To put the mission first, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to make sacrifices that others wouldn't understand. I never stopped doing any of those things. But we couldn't see it, Dad said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like grief. We couldn't see that our daughter was living every value we'd tried to teach her, just in ways we didn't recognize. The restaurant was filling up with the early dinner crowd, couples, families, business associates conducting their own conversations at their own tables. Normal people having normal conversations about normal problems, none of them dealing with the aftermath of discovering that someone they'd known their entire life was actually a complete stranger. I need to ask you something, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I need you to be honest with me. I waited. Did you ever consider telling us? Ever want to share what you were really doing? The question hit deeper than I expected. I thought about all the family dinners, where I'd sat quietly while Marcus talked about his Bronze Star, all the holidays where relatives asked about my desk job, with barely concealed pity. All the moments when I'd wanted to scream that I was saving lives too. Just differently. Every day, I admitted, every single day I wanted you to know that I wasn't a failure, that I hadn't given up, that I was serving just as much as Marcus was. Then why didn't you? Dad asked. Even if you couldn't share details, couldn't you have found some way to let us know we were wrong about you? I stared at my untouched pasta, thinking about how to explain 5 years of calculated invisibility to people who had never needed to disappear. Because the moment I tried to defend myself, the moment I hinted that there was more to my work than you understood, you would have started asking questions. And questions from family members of intelligence operatives get noticed by people whose job it is to notice questions. Marcus straightened. Professional understanding replacing personal confusion. Operational security. You couldn't risk exposure, even to family. Especially to my family, I corrected. The people closest to you are always the biggest security risk, not because they mean to be, but because they care enough to dig deeper when something doesn't make sense. Dad nodded slowly, 30 years of military experience finally providing context for his daughter's choices. So you let us think the worst rather than risk compromising your mission. I let you think what you needed to think to keep yourselves safe and keep my work invisible. Mom's voice was barely audible. That must have been so lonely. The word hit me like a physical blow, lonely. 5 years of family gatherings where I'd been treated like a disappointment. 5 years of watching Marcus receive recognition I couldn't claim. 5 years of maintaining relationships with people who fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was worth. It was, I said simply. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tensions. This wasn't the silence of people avoiding difficult truths, but of people finally understanding the weight of those truths. So where do we go from here? Marcus asked eventually. How do we rebuild a family when we're starting from the realization that we never really knew each other at all? I looked around the table at parents who had spent 5 years loving a daughter who didn't exist, at a brother who had unknowingly built his identity on my invisible sacrifice, at people who meant well but had been so catastrophically wrong about someone they claimed to know better than anyone. We start with the truth, I said, all of it. No more assumptions, no more filling in blanks with worst-case scenarios, no more deciding who people are instead of asking them. Dad reached across the table, his weathered hand covering mine. Can you forgive us? For not trusting you, for not fighting harder to understand you, for letting you carry all of this alone? I looked at his face, creased with years and regret, at Mom's hopeful expression, at Marcus's genuine remorse, and realized that the hardest decision wasn't whether to forgive them. It was whether to trust them enough to try again. 6 months later, I stood in the Pentagon's E-ring corridor, watching morning light filter through windows that offered a view of Arlington Cemetery. The graves stretched in perfect rows, white stones marking the final resting places of people who had served in wars both public and secret, recognized and invisible. My new office was 3 doors down from where I'd stood. Deputy Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations, a title that came with its own parking space, a secretary who actually knew my real name, and the strange luxury of being able to tell people what I did for a living. Sort of. Colonel Mitchell, my aide, Captain Rodriguez, appeared at my elbow, with the kind of quiet efficiency that made him invaluable in managing my transition from ghost operative to senior leader. Your 0900 briefing has been moved to Conference Room C. The Joint Chiefs want to discuss the Kazakhstan situation. Kazakhstan. 3 weeks ago, intelligence intercepts had suggested a coordinated attack on American oil interests in Central Asia. Last week, a joint CIA military intelligence operation had neutralized the threat before it materialized. This week, I was briefing senior military leadership on lessons learned from an operation that would never make it into any newspaper. Some things I was learning never changed. Also, Rodriguez continued, your family called. Your mother wanted to confirm dinner plans for Sunday, and your brother asked if you could review his application for the Intelligence Advanced course. Family dinner. The phrase still felt foreign, after 6 months of slowly rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by 5 years of mutual misunderstanding. But we were trying, all of us, to figure out how to be people who actually knew each other. The Sunday dinners had been Mom's idea, a weekly attempt to create new patterns to replace the old ones. No longer did conversation revolve around Marcus's military achievements while I sat quietly on the sidelines. Now we talked about current events from perspectives informed by classified briefings I could hint at but not share, tactical challenges Marcus faced as a company commander that I could provide context for without revealing sources, and the strange experience of being a family where both children had served in ways their parents were still learning to understand. Dad had taken to reading everything he could find about military intelligence, trying to educate himself about a field he'd never paid attention to during his own service. He'd never be able to fully understand the work I'd done. The classifications would always keep certain truths off limits, but he was trying to bridge the gap between what he could know and what he needed to understand about his daughter. Mom had started volunteering with military families, working with spouses and parents of service members deployed to classified locations. She couldn't talk about my specific work, but she could share the experience of loving someone whose service required absolute secrecy, of learning to trust without complete information, of being proud of sacrifices she couldn't fully comprehend. And Marcus had surprised me most of all. His application for the Intelligence Advanced course wasn't just career progression. It was his attempt to understand the world I'd been operating in, to bridge the gap between traditional combat operations and the shadow war that had been protecting soldiers like him all along. Tell him I'll review his application tonight, I said to Rodriguez, and confirm Sunday dinner, 1,800 hours, same as always. The briefing room was already filling with senior officers when I arrived, men and women whose ribbons told stories of deployments to every corner of the world where American interests intersected with global threats. 6 months ago, none of them would have known my name. Now I was briefing them on operations that could prevent the next war. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, pulling up satellite imagery of oil infrastructure in Kazakhstan. 3 weeks ago, signals intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting a coordinated attack on American energy interests in Central Asia. The intercepts indicated involvement by the same network responsible for pipeline attacks in Iraq and Syria. I clicked to the next slide, showing communication patterns that had taken weeks to decode and analyze. Working with CIA assets in the region, we were able to identify 3 separate cells planning simultaneous attacks on pipeline infrastructure, refinery facilities, and transportation hubs. The coordinated nature of the threat suggested external funding and sophisticated operational planning. General Morrison, the Joint Chiefs representative, leaned forward. Colonel, what was the timeline for neutralizing these threats? 72 hours from final intelligence confirmation to operational completion, I replied. All 3 cells were disrupted, primary targets secured, and 15 high-value individuals taken into custody for further intelligence exploitation. The room was quiet except for the sound of pens on notepads and the subtle hum of secure communication equipment. These were people who understood operational complexity, who knew the difference between lucky breaks and professional excellence. The Kazakhstan operation represents an evolution in joint intelligence military cooperation, I continued. By maintaining real-time communication between CIA assets, military intelligence analysts, and special operations forces, we were able to prevent what could have been a significant escalation in energy sector terrorism. After the briefing, as officers filed out discussing implementation strategies and resource allocation, General Morrison approached me with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years managing complex military operations. Colonel Mitchell, impressive work on Kazakhstan. Your team's analytical methods are setting new standards for threat assessment and response coordination. Thank you, sir. The success really belongs to the operational teams who executed the mission. Spoken like someone who understands the difference between leadership and glory, he replied. That's rare at any level, but especially at your age and rank. He paused, studying my face with the attention of a senior officer making personnel decisions. I have a question for you, Colonel, off the record. I waited. 6 months ago, you were one of our most effective, invisible assets. Today, you're briefing the Joint Chiefs and managing strategic intelligence operations from behind a desk with your name on the door. Which version of yourself serves the country better? The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because someone in General Morrison's position was asking it directly. 6 months ago, I said carefully, I was very good at preventing specific threats that I could identify and neutralize personally. Today, I'm developing systems and training people who will prevent hundreds of threats that I'll never know about. That's the textbook answer, he said with a slight smile. What's the real answer? I thought about the past 6 months, the transition from operational work to strategic leadership, from invisible missions to public recognition, from family dinners where I was treated as a failure to family dinners where I was treated as a hero. The real answer is that I'm still figuring it out, I admitted. But for the first time in 5 years, I'm making that decision based on what's best for the mission and what's best for my family, instead of having to choose between them. General Morrison nodded approvingly. Colonel, that might be the most honest answer I've heard from a senior officer in 20 years. As he walked away, I realized that the question wasn't just about career progression or operational effectiveness. It was about identity, about whether the person I had been in the shadows was fundamentally different from the person I was becoming in the light. 6 months ago, I had been Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, invisible asset, family disappointment, professional ghost. Today, I was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, strategic leader, recognized hero, daughter whose parents were finally proud of her. Tomorrow, I would be something else entirely, a person still figuring out how to balance service with visibility, mission with family, the requirements of secrecy with the needs of people who deserved to know they were loved for who they really were. But for the first time in 5 years, that felt like a choice I was making rather than a burden I was carrying. And that, I was learning, made all the difference. The crisis began with a phone call that came not to my secure Pentagon line, but to my personal cell phone at 0623 hours on a Saturday morning in March, exactly 1 year after the courthouse ceremony that had changed everything. Sarah? It's Marcus. I need your help. My brother's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since his deployment days, the controlled urgency of someone trying to manage a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. What's wrong? I was already moving toward my secure home office, muscle memory from years of crisis response kicking in automatically. It's complicated. Can you meet me? Not at your office, not at the Pentagon. Somewhere we can talk without official complications. The phrase, official complications, told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was happening existed in the gray area between personal and professional, between family loyalty and national security obligations. Roosevelt Memorial, 30 minutes, I said, east side near the waterfall. The memorial was nearly empty at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, just a few early joggers and tourists who had risen with the sun to beat the D.C. crowds. Marcus was waiting by the bronze statue of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, looking every inch the professional army officer in civilian clothes, khakis pressed with military precision, polo shirt that might as well have been a uniform. But his expression was that of my younger brother, who used to ask me to help him with problems he couldn't solve alone. Sarah, I think I've stumbled into something that's above my clearance level, he said without preamble, and I'm not sure who else I can trust with it. I sat on the memorial bench beside him, noting the way his eyes continuously scanned the area around us. Operational awareness that hadn't existed before his deployment, habits learned in places where attention to detail meant survival. Tell me, I said simply. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me what looked like a standard military communication, the kind of routine message traffic that moved through Army channels every day. 3 days ago, I received orders to prepare my company for a training exercise in Eastern Europe. Standard NATO cooperation mission supposed to last 6 weeks, focused on urban warfare tactics and interoperability with allied forces. I read the message, noting the usual bureaucratic language that concealed more than it revealed. But something about the timing, location, and operational focus seemed familiar in ways that made my intelligence training send up warning flags. "What made you suspicious?" I asked. "The equipment list," Marcus replied, scrolling to another screen. "We're being asked to bring gear that doesn't make sense for a training exercise. Long-range communication equipment, specialized surveillance tools, ordnance that's way beyond what you'd need for cooperative training with NATO allies." I studied the equipment manifest, recognizing items that were typically used for intelligence-gathering operations rather than traditional military exercises. "Plus," Marcus continued, "the location keeps changing. First we were going to Poland, then Estonia, now somewhere in Lithuania that doesn't appear on any standard military maps." My blood went cold. Lithuania, near the Russian border, in an area that had been of significant intelligence interest for the past 18 months due to increased Russian military activity and reports of covert operations designed to test NATO response capabilities. "Marcus, have you discussed these concerns with your commanding officer?" I tried. "Colonel Peterson told me that operational details are compartmentalized for security reasons, and that company commanders don't need to understand the broader strategic picture." He turned his phone screen toward me, showing another message that had arrived that morning. Then this came through. "Priority orders to deploy in 48 hours, with instructions that all personnel are to sign additional security agreements, and that communications with family members will be restricted for the duration of the operation." I stared at the message, recognizing the language patterns and security protocols that suggested this wasn't a training exercise at all, but an operational deployment disguised as routine NATO cooperation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I waited. "Is this the kind of operation where soldiers get sent to do intelligence work without being told that's what they're doing? Where a company of infantry gets used as cover for something that's actually a CIA or special operations mission?" The question hit directly at one of the most sensitive aspects of modern military intelligence operations: the use of conventional forces to provide cover or support for classified missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "Marcus, there are certain types of operations that require—" "That's not an answer," he interrupted. "That's the kind of response you give to people you don't trust with the truth." He was right. After a year of rebuilding our relationship based on honesty rather than assumptions, I owed him a direct response to a direct question. "Yes," I said. "Those operations exist. And based on what you've shown me, this looks like it could be one of them." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of." "But I need to understand something," I continued. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of working through official channels? Why not request clarification from higher command levels?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching early morning joggers pass by the memorial, people beginning their Saturday routines, with no awareness that 2 military officers were discussing operations that could affect international security. "Because," he said finally, "if this is what I think it is, then my soldiers are being sent into a situation where they don't understand the real mission, don't have appropriate intelligence support, and don't know what they're actually risking their lives for." His voice carried the weight of command responsibility, the burden that comes with being accountable for the lives and safety of people who trust you to make decisions based on complete information. "And because," he continued, "I have a sister who works at levels where she might actually know what's really happening, and I trust her more than I trust the chain of command that's giving me orders they won't explain." The statement hit me with unexpected force. A year ago, Marcus wouldn't have trusted me to provide accurate information about the weather. Now he was asking me to help him navigate what could be a classified operation with international implications. "I need to make some calls," I said. "Secure calls, to people who might have insight into operations in Eastern Europe. Is that going to create problems for you professionally? If it becomes known that you're investigating operations outside your normal area of responsibility?" It was a fair question. Intelligence officers who went looking for information they weren't specifically authorized to access could find themselves in serious professional difficulty, especially when the information involved active operations. Probably, I admitted, but that's a risk I'm willing to take if it means keeping your soldiers safe. Marcus looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not the younger brother seeking help, but a fellow officer recognizing professional competence and personal integrity. What do you need from me? Everything you have. Orders, equipment lists, personnel rosters, communication protocols, anything that might help me understand what your company is actually being asked to do. The next 6 hours passed in the controlled intensity of an intelligence investigation conducted outside official channels. Using secure communications equipment in my home office, I reached out to contacts throughout the intelligence community, carefully probing for information about operations in Eastern Europe, without revealing why I was asking. What I discovered was more concerning than I had anticipated. Operation Baltic Shield was a joint CIA military intelligence mission designed to gather intelligence on Russian military capabilities near the Lithuanian border. The operation required a company-sized element of conventional forces to provide cover and security for intelligence assets, who would be conducting sophisticated surveillance operations near sensitive installations. The concerning part wasn't the mission itself. It was a legitimate intelligence requirement with clear strategic value. The concerning part was that the conventional forces providing cover had not been briefed on the true nature of the operation, which meant they couldn't make informed decisions about tactical risks and couldn't provide appropriate support for the intelligence assets they were supposed to be protecting. By 1,500 hours, I had enough information to understand that Marcus's instincts were correct. His company was being deployed to support a classified operation without being told what they were actually supporting. I called him back to the memorial, where we sat on the same bench as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bronze statues of American presidents who had faced their own difficult decisions about military operations and national security. Your instincts were right, I said without preamble. Operation Baltic Shield is a classified intelligence mission. Your company is providing security and cover for CIA assets conducting surveillance operations near Russian military installations. Marcus's expression didn't change, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly. What kind of risks are we talking about? If the operation is discovered by Russian forces, it could be treated as an act of espionage rather than a military training exercise. Your soldiers could be detained, interrogated, potentially used as bargaining chips in international negotiations. And they don't know this? According to the operational plans I accessed, conventional forces are being briefed on a standard NATO training exercise. The intelligence mission is compartmentalized at levels above company command. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing information that changed his understanding of his responsibilities as a commander. What are my options? He asked finally. Officially, none. You have direct orders from superior officers, and questioning those orders based on information obtained through unofficial channels could result in serious disciplinary action. And unofficially? I looked at my brother, recognizing that we had reached a moment that would define not just his military career, but our relationship as siblings and as officers who had both sworn oaths to protect American lives. Unofficially, you could develop concerns about your company's readiness for the assigned mission. You could request additional briefings, enhanced communication protocols, or expanded intelligence support. Would that delay the deployment? It might. And any delay would provide time for me to work through official channels to ensure that your soldiers have appropriate information about the risks they're facing. Marcus nodded slowly. That's what I was hoping you'd say. But Marcus, you need to understand the potential consequences. If senior leadership determines that you're deliberately obstructing a classified operation, it could end your military career. And if I don't obstruct it, and something happens to my soldiers because they didn't understand what they were walking into, it should end my military career. The statement revealed everything about why Marcus had become the kind of officer who could earn a Bronze Star, and why our parents had been right to be proud of his service, even if they hadn't understood the full context. Give me 72 hours, I said. I'll work through official channels to ensure that Operation Baltic Shield includes appropriate briefings and support for conventional forces. You focus on preparing your company for a mission that might be more complex than originally described. And if you can't fix it through official channels? I looked at the memorial around us, thinking about presidents who had made difficult decisions about military operations, intelligence missions, and the balance between national security and the lives of the people sworn to protect it. Then we'll figure out another way to keep your soldiers safe. The next 3 days were among the most professionally challenging of my career. Working within the constraints of official channels, I submitted requests for operational review, enhanced intelligence support, and expanded briefing protocols for Operation Baltic Shield. The response was swift and unambiguous. Colonel Mitchell was exceeding her area of responsibility and should focus on her assigned duties rather than questioning operations outside her direct oversight. But sometimes the most important victories happen in the margins of official responses. Buried in the bureaucratic language of operational updates, I found confirmation that conventional forces assigned to Baltic Shield would receive enhanced operational briefings and expanded communication protocols. It wasn't everything Marcus's soldiers needed to know, but it was enough to ensure they understood they were deploying to a mission with higher risks than standard NATO training exercises. On Thursday evening, Marcus called to confirm that his deployment had been delayed by 48 hours to accommodate additional briefings, and that his soldiers were now being informed that their mission might involve, quote, contact with foreign military forces and intelligence gathering activities. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you when your soldiers come home safe," I replied. 6 weeks later, Operation Baltic Shield concluded successfully. Marcus's company provided security for intelligence assets who gathered critical information about Russian military capabilities while maintaining their cover as a NATO training exercise. No American personnel were detained, no international incidents occurred, and the intelligence gathered helped inform strategic decisions about European security that would remain classified for years to come. At our Sunday dinner that week, Marcus surprised me by standing up during dessert and raising his water glass in what looked like an impromptu toast. "I want to say something to my sister," he began, and the table fell quiet with the attention that had become familiar whenever one of us had something important to share. A month ago, Sarah helped me navigate a situation where I needed to balance my responsibilities as a military officer with my obligations to the soldiers under my command. She provided guidance that helped me make decisions that kept good people safe while still accomplishing the mission. He looked directly at me across the table. But more than that, she showed me what it means to be the kind of officer who puts soldiers' lives ahead of career advancement, who risks professional consequences to do what's right, and who understands that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that help other people succeed in theirs. Mom was dabbing at her eyes again, but smiling this time. "Sarah, you've become the kind of officer I hope to be someday, and the kind of sister I'm proud to serve alongside." Dad raised his own glass, his voice slightly thick with emotion. "To both of our children, who serve with honor, courage, and commitment to values that matter more than personal recognition." As we toasted, I realized that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. We were no longer parents who were proud of one child's achievements and disappointed in another's failures. We were no longer siblings competing for recognition and approval. We had become people who understood that service takes many forms, that courage appears in many contexts, and that the most important victories are often the ones that help other people succeed rather than bringing glory to ourselves. Later that evening, as I prepared for another week of classified briefings and strategic planning, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I had been Colonel Sarah Mitchell, recognized hero, promoted officer, daughter whose parents were finally proud of her achievements. Tonight I was something more important, the sister who Marcus trusted with his most difficult decisions, the daughter who had earned her family's respect not just through public recognition but through private integrity, and the officer who had learned that the greatest honor comes not from the medals you wear but from the trust placed in you by people whose lives depend on your choices. The dismissal was over, the recognition had been earned. But more than that, the relationships had been rebuilt on foundations that could withstand both success and failure, both public triumph and private challenge. In the end, that was the victory that mattered most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.